Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we've been doing, Racial Capitalism and Space Privatization. I feel like this will definitely be the last little lap of like the sets of videos that I do for this series because I want to move on to talk about some other literature bases as well. But I definitely wanted to finish out rounding out this series doing something that I think is really important to just the idea of understanding what key debates will look like on this resolution as a whole, and that is what will racial capitalism look like versus critical affirmatives. I think that this strategy will be super good against K-abs and a really good way to really question how people are thinking about the role that futurism plays in different kind of affective ways of thinking about the resolution, and allows you to really have an open basis for like different ways to contest affirmatives that I think is really important. If you're kind of like just trying to figure out like where we're kind of like talking about what racial capitalism on this resolution looks like, I would definitely go back and watch the Intro to Racial Capitalism in Space video, because I think that it's a really good resource in order for you to get a good idea of what some of the foundation is for the stuff that we'll be talking about here. And I also think that allows you to kind of understand what I think are some of just the major moving parts, like what this criticism is really saying about the resolution at a historical lens, and why I think it's really important to all these different avenues, and why there's so many different parts to this video. And hopefully this video will be helpful as well, as we kind of like start off talking a little bit about just like what the best form of this criticism looks like versus K-teams, and then talking a little bit about what the framing debate is, the thesis portion of the debate, and then the next video talking a little bit about like link debating, permutation debating, impact comparison, alternative debating, all of which I think are really important to getting a holistic view of what this criticism can look like against like various critical arguments on the resolution. And so yeah, we should just get this started. So the first place that I kind of want to just talk is just what your priority should be versus K arguments as a whole. I think that a lot of critical arguments, if they're kind of like not specifically going for pessimism, will definitely go in the lens of trying to think about various versions of what futurism looks like, what ways we can think about changing the way in which we relate to questions of the human subject, things like alienating ourselves, aliens themselves, like ways in which all these kind of like ideas about this space and a different kind of life outside of the world that we live, it can kind of be created by the way in which we relate to the specific resolution that's happening here. And I think that will like kind of align itself with different critiques about why current efforts at space privatization and ways of thinking about things like SpaceX are kind of rooted in not only capitalism but an investment in like a white heteronormative future. And so I think that there are a lot of different avenues for where teams will kind of find critiques to kind of enter into that, and where literature basically comes in the same place. But I think methodologically, whether they do these things different performatively or different in terms of the way they're like writing the language of it, a lot of the affirmatives I think will still be really invested in terms of thinking about either the future or the human subject itself differently. Both are places where I think the racial capitalism doesn't like strongly defend either of those things, but I think it has good insights of like the way in which these teams might take them up. And I think that is really important for you to kind of like understand like where those indicts are going to kind of come in for like how you want to think about like ways that you're contesting the method. And I also think that it's super important in order for you to get a better idea of like ways in which you can figure out how you want to frame the debate, so that your link arguments later on make a lot more sense when you're kind of like isolating ways that you want to contest affirmatives that are kind of doing either of these things. And so I think getting a hold on like what those affirmatives are doing in that area in terms of like what their particular methodology is a place that you want to start in order for you to like start figuring out what type of framing argument you want to make to maybe contest with not an alternative vision of the future, but if just maybe just an all right out refusal or a different way of organizing things here before we move to the future, and arguments about why that's important, all could be different places where you start putting in a little bit more meat into like what the framing is doing in terms of how it's framing some of the alternative concerns. But as we're just talking about like the framing debate as a whole, I think that the thing that you should be trying to accomplish the most with the framing debate is not just your point of contestation, but what is the specific usage of debate, how are the kind of like tactics that we talk about in the debate and the various like stories and performative elements that we tell tied to the question of like what our neoliberal desires are, and what is the affirmative like held culpable for in the name of that. I feel like a lot of the arguments that you need to make are about like why the like ideas of like the future should not only be thought about in terms of just their most utopic vision and the relationship that the AF is telling them, but actively how these like visions of the world are able to kind of like become real, but through their ability to be manifested through systems that exist violently in the world right now. I feel like the idea that like for instance a lot of teams make with the futurism arguments is that being able to look at the future allows us to figure out what types of steps we need to take in order to get there. It allows us to figure out what types of politics and other types of resistance movements we should be aligning ourselves with. And so I feel like it also kind of works the other way, which is that it also kind of allows you to figure out ways that you should be thinking about the relationship that these types of visions have to the types of structures that are existent in the status quo. And so I feel like you're able to make arguments and offense that is kind of generated off of like how these types of movements become consumed by the way in which their vision is able to be produced under the veil of something claim that it's liberatory, but rather actually replicates the same privatized means that are kind of being created in order to produce ways of thinking about like creating not only the actual resource extraction of like various communities in order to make like the technology that's necessary for those futures possible, but also why those kind of like worlds at a value system level are like symbolically coded in order to like create these kind of like able-bodied subjects that are able to exist in such a utopian way that they're like community, their instant access to community, and all these things that kind of like lack texture, and how like violence kind of exists in all these orientations of the world, which I think is really helpful for you to be able to kind of like distinguish why being able to like build like arguments and things off of that is super important. I then think that when you go over to like the thesis portion of the debate, a lot of the arguments that you want to make are about why the kind of like history of racial capitalism in relationship to like ideas of futurism, not just in the context of Whitey and the Moon, which is something we've talked about throughout the lecture series, but why the ideas of like, for instance, Afrofuturism as it relates to like musical and performative aesthetics have often been commodified by ideas of black capitalism and like what it looks like to be able to access this kind of like utopian world that is created with this technology that is like replications of things that are extracted or done via these same privatized entities that are able to make empty promises in order to create like these collaborations and other forms of like consumption that only formulate the ways in which like capitalism becomes centered as a value for like what our essentials to other worlds are. And I feel like basing that as a place for how you're thinking about their reconfiguration of the human subject, or their reconfiguration of the future, could be a really good place for you to have a thesis that kind of like pivots into both of these worlds outside of what is kind of like most predictable for what people are thinking about the place that Whitey and the Moon kind of serves in this resolution. And I think that giving yourself that kind of like variability in the way that your thesis can go can really open you up to be able to like really build into like various histories and strong examples of whatever type of like model the affirmative is kind of offering. Or I think to make kind of like on the opposite end, if they're kind of going with that more pessimistic refusal of the resolution, then you have obviously a lot of arguments to make about like why that doesn't give the basis for how we should kind of be organizing politically, and what type of resistance movements we should be making when like the debates about space and privatization and things like those become inevitable facets of like our lives. Then you have like a lot of uniqueness for like why the alternative is able to do something like more productive than the affirmative. And either way that the debate kind of swings, and regardless of the way that the affirmative decides to take their methodology, you have a place to kind of stand yourself and make competition for a lot of your other arguments to debate, which I think is like a really good position to be in as we begin to talk about some of these other portions of the flow as well. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into other videos I'll be doing talking about like racial capitalism, space privatization, and everything else debate. And yeah, thank you.